The wind cuts across Angikuni Lake like a blade, carrying with it the kind of silence that makes seasoned trappers pause mid-step and question what their ears aren't telling them. Joe Labelle pressed his snowshoes deeper into the November snow, the leather bindings creaking against his boots as he approached what should have been the familiar bustle of an Inuit winter camp. 6 traditional tents arranged in the protective curve of the shoreline, smoke rising from cooking fires, the distant laughter of children playing between the structures. Instead, he found nothing but the hollow whisper of wind through empty canvas. What Labelle discovered that day, in late November of 1930, would become one of North America's most enduring mysteries, a story that would spawn decades of speculation, government denials, and questions that reach far beyond the frozen expanse of the Canadian Arctic. The implications of what he claimed to witness would challenge everything we thought we knew about disappearances, official records, and the thin line between folklore and fact. Labelle had been trapping this region for less than a season, but even his inexperienced eyes could read the signs that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The tents remained standing, their hide walls intact against the subarctic wind, but the silence within them felt dense, almost physical. No voices called out in greeting. No dogs barked his arrival. The usual markers of life, the crunch of footsteps in snow, the scrape of tools against ice, the low murmur of conversation, had been replaced by an emptiness so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply lack it. As he moved closer to the first tent, Labelle's breath formed quick puffs of vapor in the -20 air. The snow around the camp bore the faint impressions of recent activity boot prints, sled tracks, the scattered remains of daily life. But these traces felt old, abandoned, as if whoever had made them had simply stepped out of existence mid-task. His gloved hands trembled as he reached for the first tent flap, and it wasn't entirely from the cold. The interior revealed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Personal belongings remained exactly where they had been left, as if their owners had intended to return within minutes rather than hours. Sleeping furs lay still warm to the touch, or so Labelle would later claim. Tools rested beside half-completed projects. Most disturbing of all, food remained partially prepared, as though the camp's inhabitants had been interrupted in the middle of their evening meal. 25 people had simply vanished without a trace. Labelle backed out of the tent, his heart hammering against his ribcage as the full scope of what he was witnessing began to settle in. This wasn't a planned relocation or a hunting expedition gone long. This was something else entirely, something that left behind all the physical evidence of life while removing every trace of the living. The mathematical impossibility of it struck him immediately. How does an entire community disappear so completely that not even their most essential possessions travel with them? The wind picked up, setting the empty tent walls flapping with a sound like distant applause, mocking and hollow. Labelle's eyes swept across the camp perimeter, searching for any sign of struggle, any indication of where 25 human beings could have gone in the span of what appeared to be mere hours. The snow told him nothing. The lake offered no answers. The forest beyond the camp maintained its eternal silence. Standing there in that impossible emptiness, Joe Labelle made a decision that would thrust him into the center of a mystery that continues to defy explanation nearly a century later. He would report what he had found. He would tell the authorities about the empty camp, the abandoned belongings, and the complete disappearance of people who should have been impossible to lose. But what happens when the story you tell is so strange that even you begin to question whether you really saw what you think you saw? Before we dive deeper into this rabbit hole, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this mystery has already got your attention, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started. And trust me, the truth behind Lake Angikuni is far stranger than even the legends suggest. The question that would plague investigators for decades was deceptively simple. If Joe Labelle really did find an abandoned camp at Angikuni Lake, why does no official record of his discovery exist? The telegraph key clicked out its urgent message across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, each tap carrying Joe Labelle's impossible story from the remote trading post at the Pas, Manitoba, towards civilization and the desk of a newspaper reporter who would change everything. The implications of what Labelle claimed to have discovered would soon explode far beyond the confines of a single abandoned camp, transforming a local mystery into an international sensation that would test the very foundations of official record-keeping and government transparency. Emmett E. Kelleher had covered his share of strange stories during his years working the Canadian border beat for American newspapers, but nothing had prepared him for the report that crossed his desk on November 27, 1930. The dateline read, "The Pas, Manitoba, a frontier town that served as the last outpost before the true wilderness began, and the story it contained would soon appear in the Bee, a Virginia newspaper, under a headline that captured the impossible nature of what Labelle claimed to have witnessed. Vanished Eskimo tribe gives North mystery stranger than fiction." Kelleher's account painted a picture of systematic disappearance that defied rational explanation. According to his sources, Labelle had discovered not just an empty camp, but evidence of lives interrupted so suddenly that their owners seemed to have simply evaporated mid-action. The reporter's prose carried the kind of breathless urgency typically reserved for natural disasters or acts of war, but this was something far more unsettling, a mystery that seemed to violate the basic laws of how people vanish. The details Kelleher included in his report would become the foundation for nearly a century of speculation and debate. 6 traditional tents, he wrote, arranged in the customary semicircle that provided wind protection while maintaining social cohesion. 25 people, men, women, children, gone without explanation. Personal belongings undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no indication of planned departure, no trail leading away from the camp that searchers could follow. But perhaps most chilling were the small, intimate details that suggested lives interrupted without warning. Half-sewn garments with needles still embedded in the fabric, as if someone had looked up from their work and simply stopped. Cooking fires that had burned down to cold ash, their meals abandoned mid-preparation. The kinds of details that transform a simple missing persons case into something that haunts the imagination long after the facts have been reported. Kelleher's story also introduced the world to Joe Labelle himself, describing him as an experienced trapper familiar with the rhythms and patterns of Inuit seasonal migration. This detail would later prove crucial to understanding how the story spread and why it might have been accepted so readily by readers hungry for frontier mysteries. An experienced woodsman reporting something impossible carried more weight than a newcomer, making wild claims about things he didn't understand. The article's publication marked a turning point in how the Lake Angikuni incident would be remembered and retold. What had begun as one man's disturbing discovery became, through Kelleher's reporting, a story with enough credibility and detail to capture imaginations far beyond the Canadian wilderness. The Bee's circulation carried the tale to American households, where readers consumed their morning coffee alongside accounts of a mystery that seemed to emerge from the pages of a Gothic novel rather than the sober reporting of frontier journalism. Within days of its publication, Kelleher's article began to ripple outward through the interconnected network of American newspapers that shared stories across regional boundaries. The tale of the vanished Inuit camp spread from Virginia to newspapers in other states, each retelling adding its own subtle embellishments and interpretations while maintaining the core impossibility of Labelle's claims. The speed with which the story spread revealed something crucial about the era in which it emerged. This was 1930, a time when the Canadian Arctic remained genuinely mysterious to most Americans, a vast expanse of territory where anything seemed possible and official oversight remained thin enough that entire communities could theoretically slip through the cracks of bureaucratic attention. The story felt plausible, precisely because it emerged from a place where plausibility itself seemed elastic. Yet even as Kelleher's account spread across American newspapers, creating the foundation for what would become one of North America's most enduring mysteries, something significant was already happening in the official channels that would later cast doubt on everything the trapper claimed to have witnessed. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the organization responsible for law enforcement and emergency response across the vast Canadian wilderness, were beginning to take notice of the story spreading through American newspapers. Their response would prove far different from what readers of the Bee might have expected, and their investigation into Labelle's claims would reveal discrepancies that transformed the entire mystery from a question of what happened to the missing people into something far more complex. What happens when the official guardians of truth and order examine a story that has already captured the public imagination, only to discover that the evidence supporting that story might not exist at all? Sergeant J. Nelson sat in his cramped office at the Paz Detachment the January wind of 1931, rattling the windows as he reviewed the growing stack of newspaper clippings that had begun arriving from across the United States, each one recounting the impossible tale of the vanished Inuit camp at Lake Angikuni. The disconnect between what the newspapers were reporting and what his official files contained would soon expose a chasm between public fascination and bureaucratic reality that raises questions far more troubling than a simple case of missing persons. Nelson had been with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police long enough to recognize when a story didn't align with the methodical record-keeping that governed his profession. Every incident in his jurisdiction generated paperwork, dispatch logs, investigation reports, witness statements, search coordination documents. The apparatus of official response left behind a paper trail as reliable as fingerprints, and that trail told Nelson something that would fundamentally challenge everything the American press had been reporting about Joe Labelle's discovery. There was no foundation for this story. None whatsoever. The sergeant's internal memo, dated January 15, 1931, would become a crucial document in understanding how the Lake Angikuni mystery transformed from reported fact into enduring legend. His investigation had revealed discrepancies that went beyond simple miscommunication or clerical oversight. These were fundamental contradictions that suggested the entire narrative might have been constructed from fragments of truth, speculation, and perhaps deliberate embellishment. Nelson's first discovery involved the photographs that had accompanied some newspaper accounts of the vanished camp. One image, presented as evidence of the abandoned site Labelle had discovered, actually dated to 1909, more than 2 decades before the trapper's alleged discovery. The photograph showed an Inuit camp, certainly, but it depicted a scene from an entirely different time and place. Its inclusion in contemporary reporting raising immediate questions about the accuracy of other details in the published accounts. Even more significant was what Nelson learned about Joe Labelle himself. The experienced trapper, described in Kelleher's newspaper account, a man intimately familiar with the patterns of Inuit seasonal migration and the rhythms of Arctic survival, turned out to be something quite different. According to Nelson's investigation, Labelle had obtained his first trapping license only that season. He was a newcomer to the region, not the seasoned frontiersman that newspaper readers had been led to believe. This revelation cast an entirely different light on Labelle's reported discovery. An inexperienced trapper encountering his first abandoned indigenous camp might easily misinterpret signs that a veteran woodsman would read correctly. Seasonal migration, temporary relocation, planned hunting expeditions, all of these could leave behind camps that appeared abandoned to untrained eyes, while representing nothing more than the normal patterns of survival in harsh territory. Nelson's investigation also revealed gaps in the official communication chain that newspaper accounts had described in detail. According to published reports, Labelle had immediately telegraphed the mounted police from a nearby trading post, triggering an official response and search effort. Yet Nelson's review of dispatch logs and communication records showed no such telegraph messages, no alerts about missing persons at Lake Angikuni, no mobilization of search resources in response to Labelle's alleged report. The sergeant found himself confronting a mystery that was simultaneously more and less complex than what newspaper readers had been consuming with their morning coffee. More complex because it involved understanding how a story with no official foundation could spread so widely and be accepted so readily. Less complex because the physical evidence suggested that whatever Labelle had discovered, if he had discovered anything at all, fell well within the normal range of frontier life, rather than the supernatural disappearance that had captured public imagination. Yet Nelson's investigation raised as many questions as it answered. If Joe Labelle hadn't made an official report about vanished people at Lake Angikuni, how had his story reached Emmett Kelleher's desk at the pause? If there had been no official search, no mobilization of resources, no bureaucratic response to a reported mass disappearance, what exactly had Kelleher been reporting when he filed his story for the Bee? The gap between public narrative and official record suggested something more subtle than simple hoax or deliberate deception. It pointed toward the possibility that truth itself could become elastic in the vast spaces of the Canadian wilderness, where stories traveled faster than facts, and where the absence of immediate official verification allowed imagination to fill in details that bureaucracy would later contradict. Nelson's memo would remain buried in Royal Canadian Mounted Police files for decades, its conclusions known only to law enforcement personnel, while the story it contradicted continued to spread through popular culture, gaining new details and new believers with each retelling. The sergeant had documented something crucial, the moment when myth began to diverge from measurable reality. But his investigation had also revealed something else, something that would prove even more significant. As the decades passed and the Lake Angikuni story evolved from newspaper curiosity into cultural phenomenon, the absence of official records didn't necessarily prove that nothing had happened at Lake Angikuni. It might simply prove that whatever had happened fell outside the boundaries of what officials were prepared to acknowledge or investigate. By 1959, the spare newspaper account that Emmett Kelleher had filed from the pass had transformed into something far more elaborate and terrifying, complete with details so vivid they seemed to have been witnessed firsthand rather than imagined decades after the fact. The evolution of the Lake Angikuni story, from simple mystery into full-blown legend, reveals how folklore operates in the modern age, turning fragments of uncertainty into monuments of supposed fact that can outlast the very records they claim to represent. Frank Edwards sat at his typewriter in the late 1950s, crafting what would become the definitive popular account of the vanished Inuit camp for his book, Stranger Than Science. Edwards possessed something that Kelleher's original 1930 report lacked: the luxury of hindsight and the storyteller's instinct for the kinds of details that transform curiosity into obsession. His version of the Lake Angikuni incident would introduce elements that had never appeared in any contemporary account, yet would become so deeply associated with the mystery that future researchers would treat them as established fact. Edwards' retelling painted a scene of such specific, haunting detail that readers could practically smell the cold air and feel the crunch of snow beneath their feet. In his account, the abandoned meals weren't simply partially prepared as Kelleher had reported, but were still warm when Labelle discovered them, as if the cook had stepped away moments before the trapper's arrival. Sewing needles remained embedded in half-completed garments, exactly where they had been left when their owners had looked up from their work for the final time. But Edwards added something even more disturbing: the sled dogs. According to his version, Labelle had found 7 dogs tied to stakes around the camp's perimeter, all of them starved to death, their bodies preserved by the Arctic cold. The image was viscerally powerful: loyal animals, left to die by people who would never have abandoned them voluntarily. Physical proof that whatever had happened to the camp's inhabitants had been sudden, unexpected, and complete. Most chilling of all was Edward's description of an exhumed grave. In his telling, Labelle had discovered that someone or something had dug up a recently buried body from the camp's small cemetery, removing it for purposes that defied rational explanation. The violated grave became, in Edward's hands, evidence that the disappearance involved forces beyond human comprehension, something that operated according to logic that living minds couldn't grasp. These additions to the original story reveal the storyteller's art at work, transforming a sparse newspaper account into something that engaged all the senses and triggered deep, primal fears. Edwards understood that mystery thrives on specificity, that readers needed concrete details to make the impossible feel real. His warm meals, embedded needles, starved dogs, and empty grave provided exactly the kind of visceral anchors that transformed abstract disappearance into personal nightmare. The success of Stranger Than Science ensured that Edwards' enhanced version would become the template for future retellings, each subsequent account building on his additions, while introducing new embellishments of their own. The story began to exhibit the characteristic growth pattern of modern folklore, accumulating details like a snowball rolling downhill, each new telling adding weight and complexity to what had begun as a relatively simple newspaper report. Within a decade of Edwards' publication, the Lake Angikuni story had acquired additional elements that pushed it even further from its origins. UFO researchers began incorporating the incident into their files, adding accounts of strange lights seen in the area around the time of the disappearance. These weren't present in any contemporary 1930 reports, but they fit perfectly with the emerging cultural fascination with aerial phenomena and extraterrestrial visitation that characterized the late 1950s and early 1960s. One particularly persistent edition involved a witness named Armand Laurent, who allegedly reported seeing mysterious lights heading toward Lake Angikuni shortly before the disappearance. Laurent's account provided the UFO angle with exactly what it needed: a named witness and a specific sighting that could be connected to the vanished camp. Yet, like so many details that had accumulated around the Lake Angikuni story, Laurent's testimony existed only in later retellings, with no contemporary documentation to support its authenticity. Perhaps most revealing was how the scale of the incident began to fluctuate wildly between different versions. Kelleher's original 1930 account had specified 25 missing people in 6 tents. Edwards had maintained roughly the same numbers. But as the story spread through popular culture, these figures began to inflate dramatically, with some accounts claiming hundreds or even thousands of vanished inhabitants. The mathematical impossibility of these larger numbers should have served as a warning sign about the story's reliability, yet they seemed to enhance, rather than diminish, its appeal to audiences hungry for mysteries that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Standing back from this evolution, what emerges is a perfect case study in how stories adapt to meet the psychological needs of their audiences, growing more elaborate and more satisfying with each generation of telling, while moving ever further from whatever kernel of truth might have sparked the original account. But the question that would prove most troubling to serious researchers wasn't whether the story had grown in the telling that much was obvious, but whether there had been any original truth to grow from at all. Dr. Brian Dunning stared at his computer screen in the early 2000s, surrounded by stacks of research materials, as he attempted something that should have been straightforward: finding primary source documentation for one of North America's most famous disappearance cases. What he discovered would reveal the disturbing ease with which modern folklore can masquerade as historical fact, even when subjected to the rigorous scrutiny that the internet age makes possible. Dunning's investigation for his Skeptoid podcast represented the first systematic attempt to trace the Lake Angikuni story back to its origins, using modern research tools and archival access that previous generations of researchers had lacked. His methodology was simple, but thorough. Start with the most recent, elaborate versions of the story, and work backward through the decades, documenting each change and addition until reaching the earliest possible source. What he found was a pattern of reverse archaeology, each layer of the story revealing fewer verifiable details rather than more. The UFO elements that had become central to many modern retellings disappeared as he moved backward through the decades. The exhumed grave, the starved sled dogs, the warm meals, all of Frank Edwards' visceral additions, vanished when Dunning traced the story back to its pre-1959 sources. Most significantly, Dunning's research confirmed something that Sergeant Nelson had documented in his 1931 memo, but that had been largely forgotten by popular culture. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had no record whatsoever of the incident that had supposedly triggered their investigation and search efforts. The RCMP's official position, as documented on their website section dealing with urban legends and folklore, was unambiguous. They classified the Lake Angikuni vanishing village as exactly that, an urban legend with no foundation in their operational records. No dispatch logs documented Labelle's supposed report. No search grids had been established around the lake. No case files existed in their archives. No witness statements had been taken. The entire apparatus of official response that the story required simply hadn't existed. Dunning's investigation also revealed something that earlier researchers had missed: the crucial importance of Emmett Kelleher's original 1930 newspaper account. Previous skeptical analysis had assumed that the Lake Angikuni story had originated with Frank Edwards' 1959 book, making it relatively easy to dismiss as mid-century sensationalism. But the discovery of Kelleher's contemporary reporting complicated that dismissal, providing evidence that some version of the story had indeed circulated in 1930, just as the legend claimed. This archival correction transformed the nature of the mystery itself. The question was no longer whether the story was a complete modern fabrication, but rather what kernel of truth, if any, lay behind Kelleher's original report, and how that kernel had been transformed by nearly 3 decades of retelling before Edwards committed his enhanced version to print. Dunning's research also exposed the mathematical absurdity that had crept into later versions of the story. While Kelleher's original account had specified 25 people in 6 tents, numbers that corresponded to a believable extended family group, later retellings had inflated these figures to hundreds or even thousands of vanished inhabitants. The logistics of supporting such populations in the harsh environment around Lake Angikuni made these larger numbers not just unlikely, but physically impossible. The geographic reality of the lake itself provided additional context that earlier researchers had largely ignored. Angikuni Lake sits in what is now Nunavut, a region of Canadian shield rock and barren ground tundra that remains uninhabited today. The nearest regional hub, Baker Lake, lies considerable distance away across terrain that would have made regular habitation challenging even for communities adapted to Arctic conditions. More importantly, the lake sits along traditional caribou migration corridors, seasonal highways that indigenous communities would have used for hunting expeditions rather than permanent settlement. The presence of a temporary camp in the area would have been entirely normal, as would its abandonment when the hunting season ended, or when caribou herds moved to different grazing areas. This geographic context suggested a prosaic explanation for whatever Joe Labelle might actually have discovered. Rather than finding evidence of supernatural disappearance, he might have encountered nothing more mysterious than a seasonal hunting camp that had been abandoned, according to patterns that had governed survival in the region for centuries. Yet Dunning's investigation, thorough as it was, couldn't entirely resolve the central mystery. While he had documented the absence of official records and exposed the story's evolution from simple newspaper account to elaborate legend, he couldn't definitively prove that Labelle had never found an abandoned camp at Lake Angikuni. The absence of evidence, as researchers know, isn't necessarily evidence of absence. What Dunning had accomplished was something perhaps more valuable than definitive debunking. He had demonstrated how stories evolve in the modern age, accumulating authority and detail through repetition, while moving ever further from any verifiable foundation. The real mystery of Lake Angikuni wasn't what had happened to 25 missing people in 1930. It was how a single newspaper story with no official corroboration had transformed into one of North America's most enduring legends, complete with vivid details that felt more real than reality itself. The Lake Angikuni mystery sits at the center of a vast web of similar stories that stretch across North America like nodes in an invisible network, each one following the same troubling pattern of official denial, public fascination, and evidence that seems to dissolve under scrutiny while growing stronger in popular memory. Understanding this pattern reveals something far more significant than the fate of one alleged vanished camp. It exposes how modern societies create and maintain their own folklore, often in direct opposition to the institutions supposedly responsible for documenting truth. Researchers studying unexplained disappearances have identified dozens of cases that mirror the Lake Angikuni story's trajectory, from reported incident to cultural phenomenon, despite official contradiction. The Roanoke Colony, the Mary Celeste, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Keepers, each follows a similar arc where initial reports generate public fascination, official investigations find conventional explanations or no evidence at all, yet the mysterious versions persist and grow more elaborate over time. What makes Lake Angikuni particularly revealing is how clearly this pattern can be traced through documented sources. Unlike older mysteries where the original facts have been obscured by centuries of retelling, the Angikuni case provides a nearly perfect laboratory for studying how folklore operates in the information age. Every step of its evolution, from Kelleher's 1930 newspaper account to modern internet discussions, can be tracked and analyzed. The psychological appeal of such stories operates on multiple levels that help explain their persistence despite debunking. At the most basic level, they satisfy humanity's hunger for mystery in an age when satellite imagery and digital communication have made genuine unknowns increasingly rare. The idea that entire communities can still vanish without explanation provides a comforting reminder that the world retains some capacity to surprise us. More troubling is what the Lake Angikuni story reveals about public trust in official institutions. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police's flat denial that any such incident occurred should, logically, settle the matter definitively. These are the people whose job it is to respond to emergencies and maintain records of their activities. If they say no such emergency occurred, why would anyone continue to believe it did? Yet for many believers in the Lake Angikuni mystery, the RCMP's denial serves not as evidence against the story, but as evidence for a cover-up. This reflects a deeper cultural shift in how authority is perceived and challenged. In an era of documented government secrecy around military projects, environmental disasters, and intelligence operations, the absence of official records can be interpreted as proof of deliberate concealment rather than proof that nothing happened. The story's persistence also reflects changing attitudes toward Indigenous peoples and their relationship with official Canadian institutions. For audiences skeptical of how the Canadian government has historically treated First Nations communities, the idea that officials might downplay or deny incidents involving Indigenous people fits into larger patterns of institutional neglect and deliberate erasure. This dynamic creates a self-reinforcing cycle where official denials strengthen rather than weaken belief in the mystery. Each statement from the RCMP that no such incident occurred can be interpreted by believers as further evidence that something significant happened, something important enough to require ongoing concealment decades after the fact. The geographic isolation that gives the Lake Angikuni story its plausibility also contributes to this dynamic. The vast, sparsely populated territories of northern Canada represent spaces where official oversight remains thin enough that believers can reasonably argue that incidents might occur without generating the bureaucratic paper trail that modern audiences expect. In regions where the nearest administrative office might be hundreds of miles away, connected only by seasonal transportation, the absence of official records doesn't necessarily prove the absence of events. Modern internet culture has accelerated these dynamics, allowing believers to connect across vast distances and share information that reinforces their interpretation of events, while filtering out contradictory evidence. Online communities dedicated to unexplained mysteries create echo chambers where official denials are treated as suspicious rather than authoritative, and where the absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence of transparency rather than absence of events. The Lake Angikuni case also demonstrates how stories adapt to meet the psychological needs of successive generations. The UFO elements that weren't present in early accounts appeared precisely when public fascination with extraterrestrial visitation reached its peak in the 1950s and 60s. The story's emphasis on the violation of family bonds, children separated from parents, traditional communities destroyed, resonates particularly strongly in an era when many people feel disconnected from their own cultural roots. Perhaps most significantly, the Angikuni mystery reveals how the very tools designed to preserve truth, official records, bureaucratic procedures, institutional memory, can become obstacles to belief rather than foundations for it. In earlier eras, the absence of official documentation might have been seen as evidence that events hadn't occurred. In our current cultural moment, that same absence can be interpreted as evidence of deliberate suppression. This shift represents a fundamental challenge to how societies distinguish between fact and fiction, between documented history and compelling narrative. When official institutions lose their authority to define truth, the boundary between what happened and what people believe happened becomes increasingly fluid. The real question isn't whether 25 people vanished from Lake Angikuni in 1930. The evidence strongly suggests they didn't. The real question is what it means that so many people continue to believe they did, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. That question points toward mysteries far more complex than any single disappearance. Mysteries that touch the very foundations of how modern societies create meaning and maintain shared understanding of reality itself. The wind still cuts across Lake Angikuni with the same relentless precision it possessed when Joe Labelle allegedly made his impossible discovery nearly a century ago, but the silence it carries now holds different meanings than it did in 1930. What the Lake Angikuni case ultimately teaches us has nothing to do with vanished wedding parties or supernatural disappearances, and everything to do with the far more complex mystery of how human beings create, maintain, and defend the stories that give their lives meaning in an age when meaning itself has become contested territory. Standing at the shoreline of that remote lake today, a visitor would find exactly what Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigators have always insisted was there: empty wilderness, barren ground tundra, the seasonal migration routes of caribou herds that have followed the same patterns for millennia. No monuments mark the site of the alleged disappearance. No historical markers commemorate the 25 people who supposedly vanished without trace. The Canadian government maintains no official recognition that anything unusual ever occurred at this location. Yet the absence of physical commemoration hasn't diminished the story's power. If anything, that absence has strengthened it, allowing each new generation of believers to project their own interpretations onto the blank canvas of an unmarked landscape. The lake has become a mirror, reflecting not historical fact, but the psychological needs and cultural anxieties of whoever gazes into its depths. Modern pilgrims who make the difficult journey to Lake Angikuni and some do, despite the challenges of reaching one of North America's most isolated locations, report experiences that reveal as much about contemporary spirituality as they do about historical mystery. Some describe feelings of profound unease, as if the landscape itself retains memory of traumatic events. Others find peace in the vastness, interpreting the silence as evidence of something sacred rather than something sinister. These subjective experiences point toward a truth more complex than simple fact or fiction. The Lake Angikuni story has acquired what researchers call mythic truth, meaning that transcends historical accuracy while serving psychological and cultural functions that documented events often cannot. It provides a vocabulary for discussing fears about cultural dissolution, community breakdown, and the vulnerability of traditional ways of life in the face of forces beyond individual control. The persistence of the Angikuni legend also reveals something crucial about how memory operates in democratic societies. Official institutions like the RCMP can control their own records, but they cannot control public memory. Once a story achieves sufficient cultural penetration, it becomes self-sustaining, passed from person to person through channels that operate independently of official verification or contradiction. This dynamic has implications that extend far beyond a single mysterious case. In an era when alternative facts and fake news have become common political terminology, the Lake Angikuni story provides a case study in how competing versions of reality can coexist within the same society, each supported by its own internal logic and evidence standards. Perhaps most troubling is what the case reveals about the fragility of institutional authority in maintaining shared understanding of basic facts. The RCMP's categorical denial of the Lake Angikuni incident should settle the matter for anyone who accepts their authority to know what they investigated and when. Yet for significant numbers of people, that same denial serves as confirmation that something worth hiding occurred. This erosion of institutional credibility creates a feedback loop where mystery thrives precisely because official attempts to resolve it generate suspicion rather than satisfaction. Each bureaucratic statement becomes another piece of evidence for those already convinced that the truth is being concealed, while doing nothing to convince skeptics that the mystery deserves attention. The Lake Angikuni case thus becomes a perfect metaphor for our current historical moment, when societies struggle to maintain consensus about basic facts, while individuals retreat into interpretive communities that validate their existing beliefs rather than challenge them. The same technologies that should make it easier to distinguish truth from fiction have instead made it easier to find support for any interpretation of events, no matter how divorced from documented evidence. Standing back from the entire century-long trajectory of the Lake Angikuni story, what emerges is a picture of mystery as a renewable resource. Each generation discovers the story anew, adapts it to contemporary concerns, and passes it on transformed to the next cohort of believers. The absence of resolution isn't a bug in this system, it's a feature, allowing the story to remain perpetually relevant rather than historically fixed. The real disappearance at Lake Angikuni wasn't 25 people in 1930. It was the disappearance of shared criteria for distinguishing between what happened and what we wish had happened, between documented fact and compelling narrative, between the authority of institutions and the authority of individual interpretation. That disappearance continues to ripple outward across our cultural landscape, creating mysteries far more complex and consequential than any single vanished camp could ever be. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.